The internet has added a new facet to the art of 21st century war. Hybrid warfare involving cyber attacks, trolling, and social media disinformation has proved an effective way of galvanizing support and even tipping the public mood. A group of Ukrainian hackers have been launching cyber assaults on Russian websites since the 2014 annexation of Crimea, but they're not the only ones using these methods to shape events on the ground.
Russia's war against Ukraine. The attacks are not only taking place militarily, but also virtually. Ukrainian authorities accuse Russia of targeting government and banking websites, as well as deploying malware aimed at limiting the country's ability to defend itself, at feeding false information into social media, influencing public opinion, and reducing Ukrainians' access to information. But Ukraine is retaliating here too. Shortly after Russia invaded, Ukraine's Minister for Digital Transformation endorsed a grassroots group calling itself the IT Army. An estimated 290,000 volunteers are using a dedicated channel on the messenger service Telegram to hit back at virtual Russian attacks.
We formed an IT Army of Ukraine. So we invited people who want to help to fight this Russian invasion on different fronts. And they basically were focused on two things. First, fight disinformation, and also take down Russian infrastructure, digital infrastructure, because they were attacking us for 8 years. So the war with Russia started not a week ago. It started almost 8 years ago, and they were instantly attacking us.
The IT Army includes members of the hacktivist collective Anonymous. The collective claims that over the past 2 weeks it has successfully leaked information from the Russian Ministry of Defense database and hacked into Russian state television and streaming services to show uncensored news of the attacks on Ukraine. Cyber attacks are often difficult to verify. However, some cybersecurity experts are voicing concern. Such attacks, they say, could be considered an act of war and lead to further escalation of the conflict.
For more on the virtual scale of this war, I'm joined now by Joshua Tucker. He's the director of NYU's Jordan Center for Advanced Study of Russia and an expert on the relationship between social media and politics. Mr. Tucker, thank you so much for joining us on the day. This war is seemingly unfolding live on social media. How are different actors using it, and how is that impacting events?
Thanks so much for having me here today. Yeah, I think this is kind of one of the things that's most interesting here is just how quickly information is able to be transmitted from what's happening on the ground globally. And that's had a couple of different effects. One effect is that it made the kind of original Russian disinformation campaign in the lead up to the election, which was based around disinformation around ideas that Ukrainians didn't like their president, that Ukrainians would welcome the Russians as liberators, that there was genocide against Russia, there was genocide against Russians in the eastern part of the country going on. It's kind of made those narratives sort of evaporate overnight, at least outside of Russia. The second thing that's happening here is that I think that social media has kind of been instrumental in amplifying the effect of the sanctions. One of the most amazing things we've seen about these sanctions is that companies, whereas in the past companies might have tried to skirt sanctions to be able to sell their products, now companies are even getting ahead of sanctions by pulling out of Russia. And I think that that's largely being driven by the realization among Western companies that they're living in a kind of very different era where social media allows sentiment around companies and how they're dealing with big public political events, like was the case in 2020 in the United States around the social justice movement, that's become this kind of incredibly sort of powerful force as well.
Let's talk about the situation in Russia itself. At this point, independent media is effectively banned, and access to many social media platforms has been restricted by the government in Moscow. What kind of information do Russians have access to? What are they seeing of this war?
I mean, the bottom line is that most Russians, if they get their news from television, are seeing the official state narrative. And the official state narrative runs along a number of dimensions, that this is the fault of the West, that this is a sort of natural reaction to an entire period of NATO expansion going since the end of the Cold War that's been going on for 30 years. This overwhelming narrative, as I said before, that, you know, that Ukrainians didn't like their government, that they were ruled by Nazis, that this was actually an attempt at denazification. These are the narratives that people are getting on Russian television. But what's also happened, as you correctly note, since the start of the war, has been a crackdown on what used to be a more open system for Russians to get their news on the internet. We've seen the end of or even on radio, we've seen the crackdown on sort of the last few remaining independent media voices that were accessible on the internet or on radio. And we've also seen moves to ban outside social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, all of which is designed to make it harder and harder for Russians to get access to information that's circulating widely in the rest of the world about what's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine, including the sort of the setbacks that the Russian military is having fighting this war.
But these restrictions must be noticeable to everyday citizens. How is the censorship being perceived in Russia?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think on some level, we might look at this and see that if Russians suddenly realize that Facebook has been taken away, that Twitter's been taken away, that television channels they used to watch are taken away, it might be something that signals to them that the war is not going as well as Putin might have hoped. However, it's important to realize that, you know, just as in Ukraine, this has led to a surge in patriotism. We generally tend to see when countries get involved in foreign conflict effects, what are known as conflicts, what's known as rally around the flag effects. And so I think people, especially in the early days of conflict, are willing to sort of accept a lot what their government is telling them in terms of, you know, the necessity of sacrificing for the war effort, the importance of the effort for what's going on for Russia. However, some narratives are going to get increasingly hard to sustain. And that's where you get into the questions around particularly the sanctions, right, which are going to have real effects, are already having very real effects on lives of ordinary Russians. And you also get into the question of the reality of the results from the battlefield, right? There are Russian soldiers who are not going to be coming home. And as those numbers increase and as the time goes by, that begins to conflict with sort of official narratives, and it becomes harder for these things to be separated. It's also the case that Russians are able to access VPNs to try to get information from outside of Russia, but that then leads to the ramping up of repression to try to prevent people from doing this.
Interesting stuff. Joshua Tucker, director of NYU's Jordan Center for Advanced Study of Russia. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Ukraine and Poland are calling it genocide. Western allies are calling it the indiscriminate use of weapons. A deadly attack on a maternity hospital in the besieged city of Mariupol has prompted demands for an international investigation into possible war crimes. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris has spoken of atrocities of unimaginable proportions taking place since the invasion began. Amid reports that Russia is using cluster bombs and thermobaric weapons, the war on Ukraine appears to be entering a new level. And I want to bring in now Lauren Speranza. She's the director of the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and she joins us now from Washington, D.C. Ms. Speranza, good to see you. Russia's attacks seem to be growing more and more indiscriminate. What's the strategy behind that, if there is one?
Well, thanks for having me. I do think the strategy behind this is Russia is resorting to its traditional way of war. It's the playbook that we've seen in Georgia, in Chechnya, in Syria, which involves this kind of indiscriminate attacks that we're seeing, applying massive firepower, rockets, artillery, missiles against major population centers, essentially to try and rough up the city enough that it allows Russian forces to move in and to facilitate their occupation. And I do think there is a blatant disregard for what they are targeting with these strikes and these shellings. But part of this is also their strategy to try and break the resistance of the Ukrainian people. So I'm not surprised that we're starting to see this horrible humanitarian catastrophe take place.
Western nations worry that Russia might be planning a false flag operation to justify the use of non-conventional weapons. What's your take on that?
I do think it's a real concern. I mean, we saw through the US's strategy of kind of aggressive declassification of some of Russia's false flag operations before the initial invasion, that this is clearly in the Russian playbook to try and manipulate the information environment. But I think the Ukrainian people, at least, and now increasingly Western citizens are very much aware of these types of tactics. And I do think that the Russians may attempt something like this to justify the use of a chemical weapon. I think the use of a tactical nuclear weapon is considerably lower than that. But we've seen the use of these weapons in other contexts, and I do think there is great concern that that's a possibility here.
Now, while all of this is going on, the two sides met for the first time on the ministerial level in Antalya in Turkey. I want to show you a clip of what Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov said after the meeting. Let's listen in and then come back to you.
Are we planning to invade other countries? No, we are not. We didn't attack Ukraine. As we've explained many times, a situation directly threatening the security of the Russian Federation was created in Ukraine.
And Lawrence Speranza is still with us. The Russian foreign minister, they're saying we didn't attack Ukraine and we're not planning to invade other countries. The first statement is, of course, false. We know that. What do you make of the second? Ukraine's and Russia's neighbors, especially those without a NATO membership, have been holding their breath for months now.
Right. Well, I think this underlines that the Kremlin cannot be taken at its word, of course. We can't believe anything we're hearing coming out of the Kremlin. And I do worry about the future of countries that don't have a NATO guarantee. I'm thinking about Georgia or Moldova, for example. The value of being part of the NATO alliance has been made crystal clear by all of these events. And I don't think that is a line that Putin wants to cross to invade a NATO ally. But I do think, other countries that are not part of that umbrella and have those security guarantees are at risk. Now, that said, I do think the Russian military forces are facing significant setbacks on the ground. This war is a lot more costly and time-consuming than Putin hoped it would be. So I do think in the long run, this is going to drain the Kremlin's willingness or desire for kinetic operations elsewhere. So while we might not see a conventional invasion in the short term, I do think they're going to continue to up the ante on political warfare and kind of other types of hybrid threats.
On Friday, Vladimir Putin is going to meet with Belarusian President Lukashenko. What's his role been in all of this?
Well, Lukashenko is trying to walk a very delicate line. I think, he likes to pretend that his country has no role in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but his decision to dance to Moscow's tune is one of his own choosing. And he is contradicting himself in some of the statements, claiming that, Belarusian territory is not being used for certain strikes or as a conduit for Russia's invasion. But while he doesn't want to be dragged into a full-scale war with Ukraine, because I don't think that's in the populace's interest in Belarus, he also cannot be seen to be a traitor to Vladimir Putin, because he dug his own grave. He's completely dependent on Kremlin support. So both of those options would be disastrous for him if he can't balance these two.
Now, this operation is not going according to plan for Putin. You said it before, he's facing tough resistance and he doesn't have the money or troops to occupy the country. What do you think could be an off-ramp for him here?
Well, I think his invasion in the first place shows that he was never truly interested in diplomacy. So I don't think that there's any concession that the West can make to kind of end this neatly for Putin. Clearly, there is a lot of Ukrainian resistance. And I think the longer that this goes on, as you said, the more difficult it's going to be for Putin and the Kremlin to sustain. The sanctions are starting to squeeze. It's more difficult for him to be able to actually hold the territory. And even in the long run, I think Putin will be hard-pressed to be able to operate and build and sustain some of the critical infrastructure that's being destroyed in
We're going to have to leave it there. I'm really sorry. We're running out of time. Lawrence Speranza, thank you so much for your insights.
A special report from the city of Kharkiv in the east of Ukraine and the country's second largest city. Kharkiv has endured nightly Russian air attacks and suffered dozens of civilian deaths and hundreds of injuries. Most of the city's 1.5 million residents have fled. Well, the Ukrainian forces fought back a Russian armoured column in the early days of the invasion, and they've been fighting since to stop a further Russian advance. Our correspondent Quentin Somerville and cameraman Darren Conway have spent the week with the Ukrainian forces there, and I should warn you that their report contains graphic images from the front line that some viewers will find disturbing.
Head to the very eastern edge of Ukraine and a ghostly vision of the country's fate unfolds before you. The city of Kharkiv is being purged of life. In near total blackout, the police in the country's second largest city take us on patrol. The Russians aren't far. Shelling happens every night. This close to the Russian border, there's another threat here. Saboteurs. No one escapes scrutiny. Alina, 76 years old, is lost and confused. In an instant, everybody's life here has been upended. But this young nation has surprised Russia and the world with its resolve. We weave our way past the fallen into no man's land with the Ukrainian army. Here is 21-year-old Yevgen Gromadsky. Where are the Russians?
Русські солдати, русські військові стоять плюс-мінус.
Over the sound of shelling, he tells me, the Russian soldiers are standing about 900 meters away from here. You can hear right now that they're firing on our positions, and we are firing back.
Поруч з даним місцем. It's a grenade launcher, British.
But it's more than just a grenade launcher, it's a guided missile. Is it good against tanks?
It's the best we have right now.
How are the Russians fighting?
They're fighting like soldiers of 1941. They attacking just like in front. Now they don't do any maneuvers. So yeah, they have a lot of people, a lot of tanks, a lot of their vehicles and techniques. But we fight in our land and we protect our families. So it doesn't matter how they fight. We fight like lions, and they won't win.
This is what people have been fleeing in Kharkiv. Endless bombardment for the past 2 weeks.
Our administration would like to inform you that a fire has started in the building. Of that reason, please go to the ground floor and from there leave the building.
This is what Russia does to cities. It bombards them, it besieges them, it surrounds them. It terrorizes entire populations. And if these tactics are unfamiliar to you, then you haven't been paying attention, because this is the Russian attack playbook, perfected in over 10 years of war in Syria. We know that Russia bombs hospitals. So here at the city's hospital number 4, they keep the wounded in hallways, away from the windows. Miss Valentina has been hit by shrapnel. I have a poem for you, she says.
These stupid Russian shrapnel pieces I will carry all my life, but as long as my heart still beats, I will still live and love.
And so too will 8-year-old Dmitry, now that this has been removed from his skull. This is the war that Russia has fought before and is fighting again. We don't know the rest of Ukraine's fate, but Kharkiv has already shown what's coming next.
Defenders, we will ride together. We will win this war, and all our heroic people will gather to rebuild our beloved Ukraine.
Quentin Somerville, BBC News, Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine.
It's Maria Avdeeva from Kharkiv, Ukraine, 10th of March, and it is exactly 2 weeks ago that Putin started the war against Ukraine. It didn't go according to Putin's plan, and that is why now he continues bombarding our cities, killing civilians, dropping bombs on residential areas, hospitals, maternity wards, killing children and women here in Ukraine because his troops cannot do anything on the ground and continue to put down their weapons and surrender. It is really cold here today, -8 degrees outside and feel like -15 because of the wind and the snow. And I cannot imagine how people here live because their houses were destroyed and they have no heating, no electricity, no water supply. But our military is doing an incredible job here on the ground, continuing to push back Russian troops away from Kharkiv. And we will win. I'm sure that we will win. Slava Ukraini!
Well, in Kiev, Russian forces continue their advance towards the capital. More than half the population of Kiev has fled since the invasion began. The mayor of the city described it as a fortress, and humanitarian organisations have warned that many people there have run out of food and are still living without water or gas. Russian forces are said to have rolled their armoured vehicles up to the northeastern edge of the city today. Jeremy Bowen has sent this report from Kiev.
When your world is turned upside down, there's separation, loss, confusion, and relief at getting out alive. Hundreds more have been evacuated from villages in the firing line outside Kiev in the last few days, taking bad memories into new, uncertain lives.
Did you see any Russians? Yes. What were the Russians like? Did they speak to you?
They were mute. They were mute. No comments, no words, nothing. They were mute. They stayed like stones.
Medics can help with the physical pain of wounds. Kiev's hospitals are ready, expecting many more. But what do you say to someone who needs the comfort of home when everything familiar has gone? This minibus was from the children's home, many with special needs and carers who'd spent 2 weeks in cellars trying to keep them calm. The police took videos to record who'd escaped. Then they checked their bags. The fear of Russian infiltrators is strong. Food is not in short supply, along with plenty of questions about what the Russians will do next and allegations about what they're doing now. The police commander said they'd had many phone calls about violations of the rights of civilians and weapons, injuries and murders. Appeals for information about the missing. At another crossing point, hundreds more walking out of the firing line. And a priest who helped rescue them from the Russian army.
There is nothing which is related to God in the actions. So there is no reason for them to attack Ukraine. We are not attack anybody. So we just made decision to have different future. We want to have democracy. So if Russians, they want to restore Soviet Union, may God bless them, but we ask them to do it within their borders.
10 miles east of Kiev, Russia's tactical blunders continued. Tanks are easy targets when they push forward, bunched up in broad daylight. But the Ukrainians are still outnumbered and outgunned. At strong points around the city, Ukrainian troops are waiting. They know the Russians are regrouping and will try again. Petrol bombs aren't all they've got. NATO has sent in thousands of modern anti-tank weapons for whatever is coming down the road.
The Russians are about 5 kilometers in that direction. If they want to come into the city, they're going to have to take this piece of ground and push in. If they're encircling Kiev, they can probably stay more or less where they are. The men at this position have to assume that an attack is coming.
For the soldiers who waited, the sky was bright and the forest still and lonely. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Kiev.